Okay, so you want to own a medieval bridge. You can already hear the coins. A merchant cart rolls toward the river. 2 horses, 6 wool sacks, one narrow stone crossing, and nowhere else to go for miles. He stops at your gate. You hold out your hand, 1 penny for the cart, another for the goods, maybe something for the animals. Multiply that by every trader, pilgrim, drover, messenger, and farmer crossing from sunrise to dark, and the bridge starts looking like a cash register with arches. There is one problem: in medieval England, you usually were not allowed to charge them. A bridge on the King's Highway was supposed to be free. You could collect a bridge toll only with royal permission, usually for a limited period, and the money was meant for construction or repair. The grant expires, the toll disappears, the bridge remains, and the repairs have just begun. That is the first correction. A medieval bridge was not automatically a toll road. Sometimes it was not even clear who owned the problem. In 1362, the bridge over the River Trent at Nottingham collapsed. Edward III ordered an inquiry to find out who was legally responsible for rebuilding it. The answer came back: nobody. The bridge had been maintained through charity and temporary toll grants, but no person, manor, or institution carried a permanent duty to repair it. The road needed the bridge, the town needed the trade, the crown wanted safe passage, and legally the broken stone belonged to no one's balance sheet. That is the business you are buying: a public necessity with private-sized bills and an owner who appears only when somebody wants the income. So let's build one. We will follow a bridge from the riverbed to the toll booth, then upstairs into the shops, out into the property portfolio, and finally back into the water when the first pier starts moving. By the end, we will know why 10,000 timber piles could still fail to make the bridge itself profitable, why a toll collector might charge a boat for passing under the structure, and why the smartest bridge owners stopped depending on the crossing long before the first cart arrived. The toll was temporary, the rent was not. If hidden business history is your thing, subscribe to Mr. Owner Middle Ages. Every episode, we take one famous business from the past, strip away the romance, and ask who actually kept the money. Today, the answer is standing somewhere between the river and the landlord. Start with the site. You do not choose a bridge because the landscape looks pretty. You choose it because the landscape has already trapped the customer. A ford may work in summer and become deadly in winter. A ferry can carry people and animals, but it waits on weather, current, daylight, boat capacity, and the mood of the ferryman. A bridge offers something more valuable than stone: predictability. The merchant can plan around it, the army can march over it, the market can grow beside it, the inn can promise beds to travelers who know they will reach town before dark. The bridge removes uncertainty from the road. That creates traffic, and traffic changes the value of everything nearby. But first, you have to put masonry where water does not want masonry. Meet Rochester. The old crossing over the River Medway had Roman foundations and a medieval timber deck. In 1381, the river froze. When the ice broke and floodwater pushed through, a large part of the bridge was carried away. That is your first operating lesson. The enemy is not traffic. The enemy is the river. 2 wealthy men, Sir John de Cobham and Sir Robert Knowles, backed a replacement. The master mason, Henry Yeveley, oversaw the work. Construction began in 1387 and finished in 1391. The new stone bridge stretched roughly 560 feet across a tidal river. The roadway was about 14 feet wide, not 14 yards. 14 feet. 2 loaded carts meeting in the wrong place could turn infrastructure into negotiation. Below them stood 12 stone piers supporting 11 arches and a drawbridge opening. But the stone you can see was not the frightening part. Under the piers sat enormous protective platforms called starlings. To create them, workers drove more than 10,000 timber piles into the riverbed, tied them together with joists, packed the spaces with chalk, and covered the mass with elm planking. 10,000 piles before the first shop opens. 10,000 pieces of timber doing nothing visible except preventing the river from stealing the investment. This is why bridges ruin people. Most businesses build upward. A bridge spends a fortune downward, underneath brown water where no customer can admire it. And the water keeps charging, timber rots. Current scours the riverbed. Ice strikes the starlings. Floods push debris into the arches. Boats hit piers. Masonry cracks. The narrower the openings, the faster water can race through them. The larger the starlings, the more they obstruct the river. Every structural solution creates a new hydraulic problem. A bridge is not a building placed over water. It is a machine negotiating with water every hour. Now staff the project. You need quarrymen, masons, carpenters, pile drivers, boatmen, laborers, carters, smiths, rope, iron clamps, timber, chalk, stone, lime, tools, barges, food, and wages. Then you need someone to supervise the work, someone to receive donations, someone to keep accounts, someone to inspect the finished bridge, someone to collect authorized tolls, someone to chase tenants later. Someone to explain why the repair fund is empty while a crack runs through the third arch. This is not one construction contract. It is an institution, and that institution needs a legal form because the bridge will outlive the men who build it. Rochester's founders solved that problem in 1399. They obtained letters patent from Richard II, establishing the Wardens and Commonalty of Rochester Bridge. 2 wardens would administer property and income for the bridge. That detail is the whole story. They did not merely leave a pile of money. Money disappears. They created an organization capable of owning land. Land produces rent. Rent arrives after the original donor is dead. The bridge becomes the reason the institution exists, but property becomes the reason it survives. Hold that thought. Before we reach the rents, let's collect the money everyone expects, the toll. In medieval England, a royal grant of pontage allowed authorized collectors to charge specified tolls to build or repair a bridge. The word sounds like a permanent right. Usually it was not. Pontage grants were commonly limited to a few years, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Long enough in theory to complete the work. Then the legal right to collect ends. Imagine opening a business where the government tells you the revenue stream expires before the maintenance obligation does. That was pontage, and the toll schedule could be astonishingly detailed. A grant might name carts, pack horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, grain, timber, wine, fish, hides, cloth, metal goods, millstones, and almost anything saleable moving through the area. At Yarm, the requested toll list stretched across pages of merchandise. And here is the strange part. Some charges could reach goods traveling under the bridge by river. The boatman helps fund the structure blocking his route. That is medieval infrastructure finance in one sentence. Pay for the obstacle because the road needs it, but do not picture every barefoot traveler dropping a coin into your hand. Exemptions mattered. Local privilege mattered. Royal charters mattered. Pilgrims, churchmen, townspeople, or favored merchants might claim freedom from toll. Empty carts could be treated differently from loaded ones. Goods for sale mattered more than a person simply walking home. Collectors had to know not just what crossed, but who owned it, where it came from, why it traveled, and which old document allegedly made it free. This turns the toll gate into a customs office. The cart stops. The merchant says he is exempt. The collector disagrees. The horse stands there. The road fills behind them. Now the legal moat becomes a legal swamp, and the grant is still temporary. This is why tolls were never as easy as they look in the painting. A penny collected is visible. The argument required to collect it is not. The toll also creates a political problem. A bridge lowers transport costs by making travel faster and safer. A toll raises them again, charge too little, and the bridge fund stays empty. Charge too much, and merchants search for another route, another market, a ferry, or a ford. The bridge creates captive traffic only until the fee makes captivity expensive. So the best bridge business cannot depend entirely on charging people to cross. The smartest owners need income that grows because traffic exists, but does not disappear when the toll grant expires. Now we reach London Bridge. The stone bridge completed in 1209 was one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in medieval England. For centuries, it was London's only bridge across the Thames, and people did not merely cross it, they lived on it. Shops and houses lined the roadway. That sounds like decorative medieval chaos. It was the business model. Buildings were planned on the bridge because rent could help pay for maintenance. The crossing created foot traffic. Foot traffic created premium retail frontage. Premium frontage created rent. Rent maintained the crossing that created the foot traffic. That is a flywheel. A literal one would have been easier to repair. Picture the road. The usable carriageway is narrow. Buildings rise on both sides. Shop signs hang over the lane. Customers stop. Carts squeeze past. Someone unloads a barrel. Someone argues over cloth. A cook throws waste where nobody should throw waste. Above the shop, a family sleeps over one of the most important roads in Europe. Below them, the Thames pushes against the piers. The location is extraordinary. The building is terrifying. And the tenant pays because every person moving between the city and Southwark walks past the door. A shopkeeper does not need to advertise across London. London crosses his threshold. That is the hidden product, not passage. Attention. The bridge concentrates movement into one thin commercial street. A baker sells to travelers. A mercer displays cloth. A cutler sells knives. A tavern serves the delayed. A landlord collects from all of them. The bridge is an anchor tenant made of stone. It brings the crowd. The shops monetize the crowd. The rents fund the bridge. Now listen carefully to who is making money. The bridge authority receives rent from the buildings. The tenant operates the shop. The tenant carries stock, labor, theft, fire, spoilage, and customer risk. The authority carries the structural nightmare under the floor. Same address, 2 completely different businesses. The shopkeeper is betting on traffic. The bridge estate is betting that rents exceed repairs. And eventually the bridge authority stops limiting itself to the bridge. The organization known as Bridge House acquired property away from the crossing as well. Rents from off-bridge land and buildings strengthened the fund. That is the moment the bridge business stops being a bridge business. The crossing becomes the mission. Real estate becomes the engine. Rochester followed the same logic. The Bridge Trust received grants of land and gifts from benefactors, including support associated with kings and wealthy donors. The income from property maintained the structure. The trust could also draw materials from its own woods and quarries. That is vertical integration, medieval addition. Need timber, own woods, need stone, hold quarry rights, need cash every year, own rent-producing land. The bridge itself may not produce enough, so the institution buys everything the bridge consumes. This is where the entire model flips. You thought you were buying a toll booth. The successful version is an endowed property trust with a transport problem attached. Now ask why charity enters the story. Bridge building was treated as a good work. A safer crossing helped travelers, pilgrims, markets, and communities. Donors could give money, land, stone, timber, or labor. Religious houses might support construction. Chapels appeared beside bridges. Alms boxes collected gifts. Indulgences could encourage donations. The bridge fund therefore sold something no normal merchant could sell: spiritual value. A donor gives property today. Rent repairs the bridge for generations. The donor receives status, memory, and perhaps spiritual benefit. The institution receives an asset. The traveler receives safe passage. Nobody calls it venture capital. The paperwork is holier. But the structure is recognizable. Capital enters in exchange for a non-cash return. And the best donation is not a sack of coins. It is land. Coins pay for one repair. Land can pay for the next 50. Now the bridge looks almost indestructible. Traffic brings rents. Property brings income. Donors bring capital. Temporary tolls handle emergencies. Woods and quarries supply materials. Then the river reminds you who owns the site. Go back to Nottingham in 1362. The bridge collapses. The inquiry looks for the party legally responsible. Nobody is bound. This is not a minor administrative detail. It means the entire maintenance model had rested on temporary solutions. Charity, past toll grants, occasional action. The bridge existed long enough for everyone to depend on it, but not clearly enough for anyone to own the bill. That is the public infrastructure trap. Everybody values the service. Nobody volunteers for the liability. Magna Carta itself addressed bridge obligations by saying communities or individuals should not be compelled to make bridges unless they were bound by old custom. From the taxpayer's side, that sounds fair. From the bridge's side, it is terrible news. Every repair begins with a historical investigation. Who was bound? Which manor? Which land? Which tenant? By what custom? Since when? The stone waits while lawyers search for a dead man's duty. And bridges do not pause deterioration during litigation. Now add fire. London Bridge carried timber houses, workshops, kitchens, candles, hearths, and stored goods above a narrow road with limited escape. In 1212, a major fire trapped people around the crossing. The exact details and death numbers are disputed in later retellings, but the business risk is obvious. You have placed combustible commercial property on top of critical infrastructure. A fire does not merely destroy shops, it destroys the rent paying for the structure beneath them. Then the bridge loses maintenance income at the exact moment it needs emergency repairs. That is a beautiful negative feedback loop. Fire removes the tenants, no tenants remove the rent. No rent delays rebuilding. Delayed rebuilding weakens the traffic. Weak traffic makes the remaining shops less valuable. The bridge can go from premium address to blocked ruin in one night. Now add structural failure. Parts of London Bridge's arches collapsed in 1281. 2 more arches failed in 1437. A bridge can remain famous, crowded, and apparently permanent while pieces of it fall into the river. That is what infrastructure does. It looks immortal right up to the inspection. And unlike a bakery or smithy, you cannot close one corner and keep operating normally. One failed arch can interrupt the route. One damaged pier can threaten several spans. One obstruction can send merchants elsewhere. Fixed costs meet network effects in reverse. The more important the crossing becomes, the more expensive its failure becomes for everyone. Now add congestion. The shops that create rent also narrow the road. The more successful the commercial frontage, the worse the bridge performs as transport. Your best revenue stream attacks your core service. Every new tenant pays rent and steals roadway. Every large sign catches attention and blocks sight. Every delivery cart serves a shop and delays 10 travelers. The bridge owner faces a choice with no clean answer. Remove buildings and improve traffic. Keep buildings and preserve rent. This is the medieval version of a platform destroying user experience to monetize the audience. The bridge is free. The congestion is the price. Now add river traffic. Large starlings protect the piers but narrow the channels. Water accelerates between them. Boats have less room. The bridge that helps land trade obstructs river trade. A loaded boat passing under an arch can strike the structure. A structure can create dangerous currents around the boat. Each transport network sees the other as badly placed, and sometimes, as at Yarm, the boat's goods may be taxed to repair the obstacle. You almost have to admire it. Now run the good year. The bridge stands, the road is busy, every shop is leased, the tenants pay on time. Off-bridge properties send rent into the fund. A royal pontage grant brings temporary toll income for a major repair. A wealthy donor leaves land, the woods produce timber, the quarry supplies stone, the accounts show a surplus, the wardens repair early, before a crack becomes a collapse. In that year, the bridge behaves like the safest asset in town. It owns traffic without owning the traders. It collects rent without buying their stock. It anchors a commercial district without brewing one barrel or baking one loaf. Now the ordinary year. One tenant falls behind, a roof leaks, a boat damages timber. The toll grant expires. The wardens postpone one repair because another is urgent. A shop remains empty for a season. The bridge is still useful. The fund still works. But part of the apparent surplus is not profit. It is deferred maintenance, wearing a clean robe. Every pound not spent today may already belong to the pier next year. That is the accounting problem with infrastructure. Cash in the chest is not necessarily money you own. Sometimes it is a crack you have not found yet. Then the bad year. Floodwater rises. Ice or debris strikes a pier. Several shops burn. Traffic stops. The tenants cannot trade, so rent disappears. The bridge needs timber, stone, labor, and emergency work immediately. A new toll requires royal authority. Donations arrive slowly. The legal inquiry into repair duties moves at the speed of parchment. Meanwhile, merchants take another road. The inn beside the bridge empties. The market loses visitors. Property values around the crossing fall because the address no longer connects anything. One failure pulls down the entire local machine. That is why a bridge cannot be judged like a normal rental property. The building and the traffic are the same asset. Break the connection, and the rent loses its reason to exist. So could you become rich owning a medieval bridge? Not in the way the title suggests. You generally could not plant a permanent toll gate on the King's Highway and keep every penny forever. Pontage was authorized, limited, contested, and directed toward repairs. The bridge itself consumed capital constantly. Its users expected passage. Its river expected tribute. Its neighbors expected economic growth. Its donors expected good works. Everyone expected something except a private owner's margin. The wealth lived beside the bridge, owned the shops, owned the inns, owned the wharf, owned the market stalls, owned the houses whose value rises because the crossing exists, owned the woods supplying timber, owned the quarry supplying stone, owned land endowed to the trust, or control the institution collecting rents from all of them. The traveler crosses once, the tenant pays every quarter. That is the difference. The crossing creates the customer. The property keeps billing him after he arrives. The strongest bridge institutions understood this. Rochester's trust survived because its founders gave it legal continuity and income-producing property. London's bridge fund became self-supporting through rents, leases, donations, and a growing estate. The successful owner did not ask the bridge to earn enough from feet and wheels. He built a portfolio around the fact that feet and wheels had to pass one point. That is a much better business. It is also why the word owner becomes slippery. A bridge is public in use, private or charitable in management, royal in permission, local in dependence, and nobody's when the repair bill appears. The clever structure is not personal ownership. It is permanent stewardship financed by assets that can survive the current operator. The founder dies, the wardens change, the shopkeeper leaves, the bridge remains, so does the rent roll. That is the final correction. A medieval bridge did not really sell passage. Passage was often supposed to be free. It sold location. It turned a river obstacle into the most valuable address in town. The toll booth was temporary. The shop lease was recurring. The donation built one arch. The endowed field paid for repairs after the donor's grandchildren were gone. The bridge itself was not the profit center. It was the machine that forced the market through one narrow street. And whoever owned the property around that street owned the part that could actually compound. You thought you were buying stone over water. What you were really buying was control over where the road touched the town. So here's the question for you. Would you take the temporary toll and the permanent repair bill? Or would you let someone else own the bridge while you bought every shop, inn, warehouse, and field made valuable by the crossing? Tell me which side of the river you would choose, and subscribe to Mr. Owner Middle Ages. Next time, we open another business from the past and find out whether the owner controlled the money or simply stood closest when the bill arrived.